Good morning, and thank you for joining us today for this Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission briefing on the upcoming elections in Bahrain. My name is Elizabeth Hagedorn. I work for Al Monitor, reporting on the U.S. State Department, and I'd like to give a warm welcome to all those watching. On November 12th, Bahrain will hold elections for its 40-member Council of Representatives in what marks the third election since the Gulf Kingdom's pro-democracy uprising in 2011. Rights groups, however, have raised concerns over the electoral process being neither free nor fair. Over the next hour, we'll examine those concerns and what it means for U.S. policy toward Bahrain, a major ally in the region and home to the U.S. Navy's Fifth Fleet. Before we hear from our distinguished panel, we'll begin with opening remarks from the co-chair of this commission, Congressman James McGovern.
Good morning, and thank you for joining us for today's Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission's virtual briefing on the upcoming elections in Bahrain. I extend a special welcome to our panelists, two of whom are joining us from overseas. We appreciate their expertise and longstanding commitment to human rights, both personal and professional. I also welcome Elizabeth Hagedorn of Al Monitor, who has graciously agreed to moderate the discussion this morning. Bahrain is a majority Shia Muslim country governed by a Sunni-led hereditary monarchy. The Commission has been tracking its human rights situation since 2010, and over the course of the last 12 years, in spite of a few hopeful moments, civil and political rights have consistently deteriorated. This coming November 12, Bahrain will hold elections for its 40-seat Council of Representatives, the only elected chamber of the National Assembly. This will be the third time Bahrainis have gone to the polls since the 2011 pro-democracy uprising made very clear that political reform was desperately needed and inspired hopes that it would be possible. Unfortunately, those hopes have been dashed. The latest evidence is the conditions in which the elections are taking place, which do not meet international standards for free and fair elections. The right of people to participate in government without discrimination is guaranteed in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and in the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, which Bahrain has ratified. But political parties are banned in Bahrain. Political societies operated as the functional equivalent in the past, but the two most important were banned 5 years ago. No organized political opposition is possible in Bahrain. The government body that administers the elections is not independent, nor is the press. One person, one vote is a bedrock democratic principle, but in Bahrain, electoral districts deliberately underrepresent the majority Shia population. This is one important reason that Freedom House has characterized the country's elections as, quote, not fair. The government prohibited international monitoring of the 2018 elections, and the same is expected this year. In fact, all of the same conditions were in place for the 2018 elections. And as the Commission highlighted at the time, the 2018 elections were not free and they were not fair, and nothing has changed since. Meanwhile, key human rights defenders, opposition leaders, and journalists remain in prison for exercising their fundamental rights. And among them are 4 brave men who have been recognized as prisoners of conscience in the Commission's Defending Freedoms Project. Abdul Al-Jali Al-Singas, a blogger and human rights activist, is serving a life sentence. Naji Fatil, a blogger and tweeter, is serving a 25-year sentence. Sheikh Ali Salman, the former Secretary General of the Band al-Wafaq Party, political society, is serving a life sentence. And Abdul Hadi Al-Khawaja, an internationally recognized human rights defender and the father of Maryam Al-Khawaja, one of our panelists today, is serving a life sentence. The convictions of these men were characterized by violations of their due process rights. Several of them have been subjected to torture and degrading treatment, including denial of health care. The cases the government has made for their continuing detention are not convincing. Simply put, they have been treated unjustly. I believe in engagement. I think it's important to have lines of communication with states we disagree with, or that do not share our values or our form of government. Bahrain was designated a major non-NATO ally nearly 20 years ago. The U.S. Fifth Fleet continues to be based there. Successive U.S. administrations, both Democratic and Republican, have considered Bahrain to be a strategic partner. What I do not support is pretending that fundamental human rights are respected in Bahrain, or that the fact that people go to the polls means that somehow there is a real election. We do ourselves no favor by lending legitimacy to an electoral process that is all form but no substance. I would like to see the reforms that were promised a decade ago get back on track. The opportunity remains for Bahraini authorities, perhaps especially Crown Prince Salman, to take steps in that regard right now. For example, prisoners of conscience should be freed without conditions, including all 4 of those I just named. Political society should be reinstated. The international press should be invited to cover the November 12th elections with no restrictions on their access. Peaceful protests or expressions of dissent leading up to the elections should be respected. I have no doubt that steps like these would be welcomed here in the United States and around the world. What the administration should not do after November 12th is somehow congratulate the Bahraini government for holding elections when those elections will not have been free and fair. They'll be a sham. So thank you again to everybody who is joining us today. I now turn the mic back to Elizabeth Hagedorn.
Thank you, Congressman. We'll now hear from Congressman Ro Khanna.
Thanks to Commission co-chairs McGovern and Smith for convening this important briefing on Bahrain's elections this year, which unfortunately will not be fair or free while peaceful opposition leaders languish in prison. It doesn't have to be this way. There's still time for the kingdom to reverse course while it's in the spotlight. In November, the Kingdom of Bahrain will be subject to international attention not only for its show of elections, but also a review of its human rights record under the UN Universal Periodic Review and a visit by Pope Francis. To start with, the kingdom should free Abdul Hadi al-Hawajah, an activist tortured and jailed for his role in peacefully organizing around the 2011 protests. I'm so glad that today we'll be hearing from his daughter, Maryam al-Hawajah, who is a leading voice for human rights in Bahrain and throughout the Gulf in her own right, and has led an extraordinary campaign to press her father's release at great personal risk. A decade ago, my Deputy Chief of Staff, Kate Gold, wrote a piece noting that al-Hawajah's release could prevent violent escalation and show respect for nonviolent movements who have fought and won reforms against all odds. Unfortunately, the same piece could have been written today. But even more than a decade in prison, al-Hawajah continues his human rights work and recently won the Martin Ennals Award for the short stories and books he's written in prison and the campaigns he continues to lead to improve treatment in prison and free all prisoners of conscience. My Chief of Staff, Gio Saba, joined his staff delegation last month and met with various Bahraini officials, including Foreign Minister Dr. Abdullatif bin Rashid Al Zayani and the Justice Minister Nawaf bin Mohammed Al Mawada. He pressed for the release of political prisoners, including Abdullah Hadi Al Hawajah and another political prisoner who I hope King Al Khalifa will immediately release, Dr. Abdul Jalil Al Sani Ghasseh. Dr. Al-Sin Ghasseh is an academic, activist, and blogger imprisoned in Bahrain whose health is declining rapidly. He was also imprisoned for his work organizing for peaceful protests for democratic reform in 2011 and named this year's International Writer of Courage, part of the Penn Pinner Prize, which goes to an author deemed to have fulfilled Harold Pinner's aspiration to define the real truth of our lives and our societies. Both Dr. Al-Sin Ghasseh and al-Hawajah, among many other Bahrainis, campaigned for the human rights of open eyes of the world to the real truth of the kingdom, and all the election pageantry won't change that. However, by releasing al-Hawajah and Dr. Al-Sin Ghasseh, King Hamad al-Khalifa can demonstrate that the kingdom is not afraid of those who speak the truth and can showcase a commitment to reform. I hope these prisoners will be released.
Thank you, Congressman. First, we'll hear from Brian Dooley. He is a senior advisor at Human Rights First. Brian?
Thank you very much. Thanks very much to the Lantos Commission for inviting me to speak, and thanks very much, Elizabeth, for moderating this session. I'm joining this briefing from Ukraine, from Kiev, where human rights are clearly under direct attack from authoritarianism, and I've been documenting human rights abuses in Ukraine and in Bahrain for many years. And while I make no comparison between the two situations in the country, there clearly has been a very different response from the US government towards human rights defenders in Ukraine compared to the US government's response to human rights defenders in Bahrain. Whereas here, the US government rightly praises the work and celebrates the work of human rights defenders and denounces attacks on them. It has too often remained silent or muted on human rights attacks, on attacks against human rights defenders in Bahrain. I've learned that governments, as well as people who are for human rights, some of the time in some places really aren't for human rights. Thanks again to the Lantos Commission, to Chairman McGovern, Chairman Smith, for inviting me to brief you today. It's more than 10 years since I was first invited to brief the Commission about Bahrain. And at that time, I raised the issues of the US government's poor response to attacks on human rights defenders and democracy in Bahrain. 10 years ago, things actually were slightly better, measurably better in Bahrain than they are now. Opposition groups were allowed to function, were allowed to exist. Some human rights defenders in Bahrain were allowed limited space to do their work. A semi-independent newspaper was allowed to function, and international human rights organizations were given access to Bahrain to be able to report firsthand on what was happening. Now, 10 years later, even though we're only days away from an election, political opposition groups are absolutely not allowed to exist or campaign or stand for election. Human rights defenders, by and large, virtually all of them have either been put into jail or driven into exile. The semi-independent newspaper has been closed down, and international human rights groups are no longer allowed access to the country. In fact, Chairman McGovern will remember that in 2014, even he was not guaranteed entry to Bahrain when he and I tried to go on a research trip there. Look, I could spend my time, and it's tempting to spend my time today to go through the litany of failures of the US government towards Bahrain on human rights over the last 10 years. And there have been many. In the last 10 years, in fact, the US government has been given, or a succession of administrations have failed on Bahrain, and Congress has given US administrations now new tools to sanction human rights abusers. But still, no Bahraini official has been sanctioned under the Global Magnitsky Act. I won't go over the failures of the last 10 years because I think it's more important, given the context of the next 2 weeks, to focus on what the US government can do right now. The next fortnight will be an intense one for Bahrain. There are elections on the 12th, but the day after tomorrow, His Holiness Pope Francis will visit Bahrain on the country's first papal visit to the country, and it's also the Universal Periodic Review at the UN of Bahrain in the next couple of weeks. All this means that there will be more focus, more international attention on Bahrain than there has been really for over a decade. And so it's important always, but particularly important now, that the US stands up and says the right things about Bahrain. You know, few things have worked in terms of trying to push for positive human rights stories in Bahrain over the last 10 years. Where there have been glimmers of success, they've often come after the US has spoken publicly and at a senior level about some sort of human rights abuses. So if we go back to the release of the medics who'd been tortured and jailed in Bahrain 10 years ago. Most of those were acquitted after the US spoke out publicly about them. My fellow panelist today, Mariam Al-Khawaja, was released from prison after the US spoke out publicly about her case, as was her sister Zainab, who was also imprisoned. When the US remains silent about cases or muted about cases or tells us that it's raising those cases behind closed doors, it just doesn't work. Now is a good time for the US to find its voice and call for the release of human rights activists and political opposition figures. It doesn't cost any money and it takes 2 or 3 minutes. What needs to happen is for a senior US official this week, why not today, to say their names. Say the name of Naji Fatil. Say the name of Hassan Mashema. Stand up and say the name of Abdul Jalil Al-Singais. Stand up and say the name of Abdul Hadi Al-Khawaja and ask for their immediate and unconditional release. We've had 10 years of the US asking for due process for human rights activists. There is no due process, judicial process in Bahrain for these people. The etiquette of asking for due process doesn't work. The behind closed conversations, the behind closed doors conversations doesn't work. The private diplomacy doesn't work. What sometimes works is when the US speaks out loudly and clearly and asks for the unconditional and immediate release of opposition figures and human rights activists. I'll leave it there for now. I would like again to thank the Commission for inviting me to speak. I honestly appreciate the opportunity to do this, but I really do not want to be back here in 10 years' time asking the US government to call for the release of these same prisoners. Thanks very much, and I look forward to questions.
Thanks, Brian. I want to let the audience know that we will be taking audience questions at the end of our Q&A with the panelists. So you can submit your questions through the form linked in the description, and we'll get to as many of those questions as we can. Next, we'll go to our next speaker, Saeed Ahmed Al-Wadai. He is the Director of Advocacy at the Bahrain Institute for Rights and Democracy. Please go ahead, Saeed.
Thank you so much, Elizabeth, for your kind introduction, and thanks a lot to Tom Lantos committee for inviting us to speak. My name is Saeed Ahmed Wadai. I am the Director of Advocacy of the London-based Bahrain Institute for Rights and Democracy. I am myself a former prisoner, a torture survivor, and currently someone who was also stripped of his citizenship. Is currently a stateless individual because Bahraini government decided to strip my citizenship in 2015. So I'm still living with these consequences. Over the past few weeks, I've been talking to civil society actors. I've been talking to individuals on the ground, and my question to them was very simple. What this elections means to you as individual? What would encourage you to take part in this election? Do you really see hope in that process? If not, then what are your objections and what are your reservations? I have to say I was, despite me following the issues related to Bahraini human rights challenges on day-to-day basis, but when I spoke to those individuals, I honestly was pretty much shocked about the level of the repression they are really going through. And it was also like shocking about like how low is this election, like how why people are calling for boycott, or why people feel they are isolated and this is not going to be really representing anything. One of the key challenges, and this is really the first one, is that the first challenge was whether these elections could change the lives of the Bahrainis, whether they can legislate, they have the power, they are effective. The most striking answer is obviously that even if the whole opposition said we wanted to run for the election, the parliament in itself in the current shape cannot legislate properly. The reason is because you have 40 seats in the what we call it the Nawab Council, and then you have 40 seats in the Shura Council. This is the appointed council. These are appointed by the king. They relatively have equal power. And we know from, say, 2006 and 2010, when opposition took part in the election, Al-Wafaq claims they have received more than 60% of the votes, only to be represented with 18 seats in parliament. What does this mean? 18 out of 40, but you're not only talking about the elected chamber, you also talk about the unelected the appointed chamber, which almost have equal power. So you cannot simply, when the experience of the opposition, when they were taking part, they cannot even change the internal policies of parliament itself. And the discussions were also so much embarrassing that people were questioning whether they can change the cost of the tomato on the street, whether they are capable of doing things like this. So it's a place where you cannot question a minister, truly question them, scrutinize them, or even get responses to letter members of parliament will be sending to different government representatives. It's also a place where we have what we would call it the political isolation law. And this is a pretty much damning law that was imposed in 2018. In summary, if you are a former prisoner, or if you are a former member of one of the dissolved political parties, the main opposition figures, we have one of them is Al-Wafaq Political Society, which was dissolved in 2016. We have the secular party, Wa'ad, was also dissolved in 2017. If you were former members of those, despite that they were at some point the government accept them as the legitimate political societies, then you are not able to take part and run for an office. You cannot be so what does this tell us? Speaking to representatives from Al-Wafaq and Wa'ad, I got this shocking figure, which would estimate between 70 to 100,000 as a conservative estimate of the number of individuals are excluded from this process. We know that since 2011, the impact of the uprising, there was thousands of political prisoners were thrown in jail. Anyone who has happened to serve more than 6 months imprisonment, they cannot run for an office. So there is this element which is seriously problematic. There is also a second element about how the government would like to persuade a fake image about true participations in the election, and this is a really tricky one. So what the government has done, they set up a committee. That committee mandated to look into those which have the right to elect. They were looking into those, and the point which was made that if you did not vote in the last two elections, the one in 2018 or the one in 2014, your name will be removed from the list automatically. We talk about many people, we know in 2014 or 18, the opposition called publicly for the boycott of the election. So there is many of those which support the opposition did not vote, and therefore now they are by default, they will be excluded from even casting their vote. That's the second challenge which these elections are facing. The second and the third most important point is about when we talk about the status of civil societies in the country, it's at its worst conditions. If you wanted to know how bad is the situation, look into the political leaders of the political societies. The head of Al-Wafaq, Sheikh Ali Salman, is serving life imprisonment. The head of Al-Haq, Hassan Mushaymi, and it's a spokesperson, Dr. Abdul Sengis, they both are serving life imprisonment. As a matter of fact, if you wanted to know how even grim the situation of those, it's not just about that they've been sentenced to life, but it's also about the fact that they are facing serious challenges in terms of medical negligence, in terms of Sengis has to stage more than 470 days of a hunger strike just to demand the return of his confiscated manuscripts, which were stripped away from him. We talk about an extremely serious challenges that families, when you talk to ordinary Bahrainis, to them it means that they have their beloved are on death row, or there are an estimate of more than 1,000 political prisoners in the country. There are really serious consequences on the day-to-day life to those individuals. I wanted to just to say this is not by any means this is a pseudo election. This is a parliament that is fake. It looks like a democracy, but it's really empty. It has no meaningful and it's not really functioning. It's important. This is why it's important. We call on the U.S. government to not to congratulate Bahrain over these elections, because they're going to use the narrative to say we are unique in this region. There is no elections. We are surrounded by dictatorship in Saudi Arabia and elsewhere, and we are the best. We are progressing, and the process could take long. These are all lies. These are the parliament in Bahrain in its current shape is a burden on the Bahraini people. This is a waste of their money, because simply they cannot really say anything and have effectively no say in it. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Saeed, for those remarks. Next, we'll hear from Joey Shea, a researcher in the Middle East and North Africa Division at Human Rights Watch.
Thank you, Elizabeth, for your introduction, and thanks to the Tom Lantos Commission for inviting us here today. So yesterday, Human Rights Watch released a 38-page report which documents the political, civil, and economic marginalization and isolation of opposition figures, human rights defenders, activists in Bahrain. As Saeed mentioned, the Bahraini government is using its political isolation laws and a series of other tactics to keep activists and opposition party members out of office and other aspects of public life in Bahrain. A report found that Bahrain's 2018 political isolation laws are being used to ban political opponents from running for parliament seats and from serving on the boards of governors of civic organizations. We also found that the government's targeted marginalization of opposition figures from social, political, civil, and economic life in Bahrain resulted in a spectrum of other human rights abuses. So to begin, as Saeed mentioned, in June 2018, the Bahraini government issued Law 25 of 2018, explicitly barring individuals from running for election in Bahrain's House of Representatives if they've been leaders or members of dissolved political societies, convicted of a serious crime, or willfully harmed or disrupted the functioning of constitutional or parliamentary life in Bahrain. So we found that this law severely restricts the political rights of any individual who falls under these categories and effectively excludes thousands of Bahrainis from full participation in the political life of the country. So, as we know, Bahrain's judiciary dissolved the country's two major opposition parties, Al-Wafaq and Al-Wad, in 2016 and 2017. And the political isolation laws introduced new punitive consequences and further extended this repression by punishing individual members of these groups in perpetuity and by individually banning these members from fully participating in political life. As Saeed mentioned, Al-Wafaq won 18 out of 40 seats in 2010, Bahrain's last parliamentary election before the 2011 crackdown. And under these laws, none of these candidates are allowed to participate in this year's elections. And in addition to the blatant exclusion of members of previously dissolved political groups, the law also includes former prisoners, including those individuals who've been convicted of speech and assembly and association-related crimes. So the law effectively targets activists and human rights defenders who were arrested in the Bahraini government's large-scale crackdown during and in the aftermath of the peaceful 2011 pro-democracy and anti-government uprising. The final clause of these laws concerning individuals who've disrupted constitutional life in Bahrain has been understood by many Bahraini lawyers and civil society members to target former lawmakers and others who resigned or boycotted their election post to protest repressive government policies. So in February 2018, 18 elected members of Bahrain's parliament and members of the Al Wafaq party submitted their resignation to protest the authorities' violent crackdown on protesters. And it's important to emphasize that this ban is retroactive. So at the time that these individuals were members of Al Wafaq and Al Wad and other dissolved political groups, it was not illegal to be part of these political societies. These societies were not banned. And also this ban is in perpetuity. There's no time limit on this ban, and there's no way for these individuals to effectively contest the ban. So if we go to the November 2018 elections, which were the first elections after the political isolation law came into effect, we found that at least 12 former opposition figures were prohibited from running. And because many others believed that they would be victims of this law, they boycotted the elections altogether. And authorities even arrested one individual, Ali Rashid Al-Ashiri, a former member of parliament, on November 13th, 2018, after he tweeted about boycotting the elections because of the political isolation laws. Now, if we go to the upcoming elections in 12 days, the final list of candidates was only released on October 26th. And so far, Human Rights Watch has learned of possibly 10 candidates and former opposition members who are prohibited from running in the upcoming election on the basis of their previous membership in dissolved political groups. It may not seem like many, but we also have to consider that the boycott campaign still exists, and many individuals are simply, not participating to begin with. As in 2018, many individuals have called for boycott of these elections. And of course, this process can be neither free nor fair when you are making political opposition essentially illegal, when you've dissolved major opposition societies, and you've banned individual opposition figures as well. In addition to the political isolation of these political isolation laws, there's also a civil isolation. So we, in our report, also documented cases of civil society organizations that struggled to form boards of governors and carry on their activities due to the impacts of these laws. So as well, in the summer of 2018, the authorities issued Law 36 of 2018, which required members of the boards of directors of civil organizations to enjoy their full civil and political rights. So this effectively extended the conditions outlined in Law 25 of 2018 to those wishing to sit as members of the boards of civil organizations. So we documented how civil society has been severely curtailed by this law as well. The Bahrain Human Rights Society, the Bahrain Women's Union, which is a union of 13 women's rights groups that are advocating for women's rights in Bahrain, struggled to form a board after this law was implemented, and struggled to carry on their activities. It may not seem that consequential to not be able to form a board, but if you can't form a board, you can't access your bank accounts and effectively run your day-to-day activities. And in many of these civil society organizations, about 80% of their memberships are members of previously dissolved political societies. So it's been very challenging for them to form a board and carry on with their activities. So our recommendations from this report, very similar to what Saeed mentioned. We're calling on the United States to pressure Bahraini authorities to end this end the repression of peaceful opposition and end its repression of civil society. Specifically, we are calling on the United States not to congratulate the Bahraini government on the outcome of the elections if they fail to implement our recommendations. We're calling on the United States government to reject the results of what will surely be unfree and unfair parliamentary elections.
Thank you, Joey. Finally, we have Mariam Al-Khawaja, who is a human rights defender, consultant, and trainer. She's also the daughter of imprisoned rights defender Abdul Hadi Al-Khawaja. Mariam, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Elizabeth, and thank you to the Tom Lantos Commission for organizing this briefing today. I wanted to focus a little bit more because I think my colleagues have done a great job covering the elections and the process of the elections and all of the problems that come with it. And I wanted to focus a little bit more about the cases and the situation inside Bahrain, especially in the prison system. We're looking at systematic denial of access to adequate medical treatment within the prison systems, where there's been outbreaks of scabies, of TB, and COVID as well. And where we've already had more than a couple of people die in prison due to medical negligence. This means that at a time when we have prison systems that are overflowing, prison cells that are overflowing with prisoners, instead of Bahrain trying to take the steps in the right direction, if they want to be congratulated, on the parliamentary elections and so on, instead of them taking steps in the right direction of releasing prisoners of conscience, releasing human rights defenders, allowing independent media to operate in the country, allowing opposition societies to exist. Instead, they're doubling down on the crackdown, where we're seeing these laws being implemented and introduced in ways to make the situation, the human rights situation, especially in Bahrain, worse. And one of the things that the Bahrainis have become really good at doing is really bogging people down in the details. And so whenever there are questions around specific cases, like my father's case, or Abdul Jalil Singh's, or Mshema, or others, what they do is they spend a lot of time sending information, document after document of details and times and irrelevant information about why they think that they're doing things in the right way. And the plan is to stop people from being able to engage in these cases, or to bog people down in the details so that they're only focused on bettering conditions inside the prison to a certain extent, forgetting the idea that these people should not be in prison to begin with. And we've seen them do this also in other ways, where they've been doing window dressing reforms, where they've actually, started things like the National Institute for Human Rights, or the Prisoner Rights Committee, or the Ombudsman's Office, and so on. But we've also seen time and time again how those very same bodies were then used for reprisals, were then used to target and attack people, instead of being set up to make the human rights situation better. And unfortunately, within Western countries, what we've seen is a very positive reaction to these window dressing reforms, even though they have not translated to bettering the human rights situation on the ground. Actually, in the opposite effect, has actually gotten worse. And of course, there's the issue of intimidation and harassment. People are still being arrested in Bahrain. This has not stopped. The use of the judiciary system as the main tool of crackdown and oppression continues in the country. I think, Joe Stork said it best from Human Rights Watch when he said in Bahrain, you don't have a dysfunctional justice system, but rather a highly functional injustice system. And I think, it's important to mention here that one of the things that we've also seen recently is Bahrain's Office of the Public Prosecution made a public threat that anyone who calls for boycotting the elections will be imprisoned for a period of 2 years and or forced to pay a fine of 2,000 dinars, which means you're not even allowed to publicly call for a boycott, which should be people's rights as part of the election process. Now, I think that if we had real access to accountability and justice in Bahrain, we would see people like the King of Bahrain and the Crown Prince, who was also the Prime Minister, and so on, be put on trial for the massive human rights violations that have been committed since 2011 and before that. But unfortunately, that's not the world we live in. We live in a world where the GCC generally lives with impunity because of their relationship with Western countries and because of the economic and security alliances that they have. I want to read a very quick quote here, which says, "We have insisted both publicly and privately that mass arrests and brute force are at odds with the universal rights of Bahrain citizens, and such steps will not make legitimate calls for reform go away. The only way forward is for the government and opposition to engage in a dialogue, and you can't have a real dialogue when parts of the peaceful opposition are in jail. The government must create the conditions for dialogue." This isn't a quote by Bahraini civil society. This is a quote from former President Barack Obama, who was saying that you cannot move forward in Bahrain without the opposition who are sitting in prison cells. And so we're still at a point 10 years or 11 years after the statement was made by the former president of the United States, where we're in the exact same condition that he talks about all that time ago. And I think part of the reason why we are where we are today in 2022 is because while we saw positive statements like this from the US government, we haven't seen an actual implementation of those words. We haven't seen an actual effect or of accountability towards the Bahraini government when it comes to holding them accountable for the human rights violations and for continuing to keep torture survivors and human rights defenders in prison. I think that generally we're looking at a worsening human rights situation in the region, whether it's the worsening human rights situation in Saudi Arabia after, President Biden fist bumped MBS during his Saudi visit. We're looking at a worsening situation in Egypt where Ala Abdel Fattah might be dying in the next 2 weeks because he's on hunger strike during COP27. And we're looking at a worsening human rights situation in Bahrain. We're really at a time right now where we have to make a decision. As an international community, we have to make a decision. Do we want to continue down this worsening path for human rights, where things will get worse, where we will see more uprisings, where we will see more unrest? And I don't think the uprisings coming in the future will look like 2011, where people will carry flowers in the face of guns, because these generations, the new generations, all they have known is violence from their governments. Or we can make the decision that, no, this is the time now where we're going to actually push for human rights, for respect of democracy, for basic freedoms. And so I think this is what, I of course reiterate the asks of my colleagues on this panel, but I also want to say that this is the time for the US government to really make that decision. Are they going to continue in their double standards of whether or not to implement accountability towards their allies the same way they do to governments that they don't like? Or are they going to decide to stop the double standards and practice accountability for all equally? Thank you.
Thanks, Mariam, and to our other panelists for your opening remarks. I have a few questions, and then we'll go to the audience for yours. A reminder that you can submit your questions through the form linked in the description. Brian, I think we'll go to you first. The Biden administration pledged to put human rights at the center of its foreign policy. Has it done so in the relationship with Bahrain? And what is your understanding of current U.S. policy towards human rights and political reform in the country? Can it be doing more to encourage reform?
Thanks very much. Thanks very much for the question. No, human rights are not at the center of the foreign policy. They're basically, well, it's hard even to see that they're in the periphery sometimes. We've, for many years now, we international human rights organizations have been advising, recommending to a succession of US administrations an approach to Bahrain, which they've by and large ignored. And they've carried on with the same policy, administration after administration, which has more or less been one of not rocking the boat, of trying to keep, as they see it, an important, valuable relationship going. And things have deteriorated. Look at the mess now that the current administration has got itself into with Saudi. Totally predictable, totally foreseen. Many of us warned the Biden administration that go in there would be a mistake. Legitimizing MBS will be a mistake. And we've been warning the Biden administration and previous administrations that not engaging with Bahrain in a more forthright, robust public manner would eventually lead to the US putting itself in more difficulty than it needs to be otherwise. So know that the human rights are not at the heart of the US foreign policy, certainly in the Gulf, and I fail to see where they are in many other places too. And that is something which could be put right. It's not difficult to just change the conversation with Bahrain. It just needs to be more public, it needs to be more critical. And I am suggesting this not out of any ideology, but because I see that the alternative, which the Biden administration is sticking to, just doesn't work. We're just not seeing the reforms that have been promised, because I would say the US has been far too muted and far too reluctant to criticize what it calls its ally.
Mariam, I think I'll go to you next. How can this administration and Congress best pressure Bahrain on the release of political prisoners like your father? And what factors appear to be influencing the Bahraini government's decisions about who to release?
Well, I think, we learned quite early on in the work that we've been doing. I've been doing advocacy on Bahrain and the Gulf and the region for about 11 years now, if not 12. And one of the lessons we learned quite early is that if you want someone released from prison, you have to make the cost of keeping them in prison higher than the cost of what they think is going to happen if they're released. And so people like my father, who's a human rights defender, or other activists, if they're released, they're seen as a threat to the government because they inspire people to speak out. They inspire people to practice their right to free expression and their basic rights and freedoms. And so I think that's where the cutoff is whether or not we're able to raise the cost on the government of Bahrain to release people. So what does it take to raise the cost? One, it's public statements, public condemnations and criticisms of the Bahraini government. This idea that silent diplomacy on its own is going to do the job has been proven time and time again to not work in Bahrain. The second thing is that there has to be action following the statements. If the Bahraini government knows that if they can withstand the storm or the consequences that comes with verbal criticisms, but they know that beyond the criticisms, there's no action that it will actually be taken against them for committing human rights abuses, for keeping people in prison, then they have no incentive to change. And so we need to create that incentive. That incentive looks like economic accountability. It looks like targeted sanctions on individuals within the government who have been involved in extrajudicial killings and torture and so on. It looks like the military relationship not continuing the way that it has been. And it looks like not having the US government meet with people like the King of Bahrain or the Crown Prince of Bahrain, who's now the Prime Minister, shake their hands and talk about how great the relationship is between these two countries. Because that's when we have, there's one side of it where you have governments like the United States and others that actually support these governments in committing the crackdowns that they're committing, whether it's by supplying them with the arms that they use against peaceful protests and so on. And then there's also the consequences of these kind of public relations and public support that prolongs the life of dictatorships. And so we need both of those things to end, and we need real accountability to start taking place if the United States is going to be serious about holding human rights at the forefront of their foreign policy.
Saeed, the Bahraini government has more or less gutted peaceful channels for the expression of opposition views. What does that portend in the long run? Does it risk fueling the kind of instability that could harm or undermine U.S. security interests?
Yes, certainly. This really imposes a very serious, great risks on the next generation Bahrain. Before, when we look into those peaceful advocates, those which would stand up for freedom or for democratic change, and they use the most peaceful tools in order to advocate for these means. When they see themselves, when you see what happens to these leaders, they get picked up, they get tortured, they get thrown in prison for life, and they get beaten up or humiliated regularly. And this is really the news you hear about how the government treats these individuals. What this is going to impose on the long term is people will begin to think about what are the other means which we can, which we could look into. And this is really where it comes into radicalization. The radicalization would happen when you take away all the voices of peaceful change. You take them away from the scene, you throw them in a prison, you silence them, and then there will be other voices which sounds, they're not going to resort into the same means, and they might be calling for different means. And this is really the danger that this government could place itself in by continuing the repression and by throwing those individuals behind bars. And I have to say that, I've been speaking to families of death row inmate Muhammad Ramadan, and one video really touched heart. I saw I heard like his father was denied a medical treatment. He was just all he needed. He needed an MRI, a scan to check whether a cyst in his neck, whether it's a cancer, or what it is. He doesn't know, and he would live to be fighting with his own body. Don't know really what this is about. It turns into his son, his 10 years old son, would have to go on video to call on the king, please, just to treat my father. I don't want him to die in a prison. This sometimes it goes to this level, and I really feel like I'm still inspired to see a child to resort to these means. But imagine what this is like, how the child would react when he grow up and see his father being going through all this injustice. The greatest thing we see in Bahrain is that there is the moral compass is clear, but also the people fight for a struggle is coming through peaceful means, and we continue to advocate for that means. Thank you.
Joey, the Human Rights Watch analysis of the political isolation laws is very useful. Can you speak to what rights guaranteed under international law that these Bahraini laws appear to violate? And are there any upcoming opportunities before the United Nations to raise this issue?
Thank you. So yeah, as I mentioned previously, and as our report outlines, these elections are pseudo-elections, and it's codified explicitly in the law. Political societies themselves have been disbanded, and now individuals have been barred from participating. And these laws violate individual Bahraini citizens' full political rights to participate in the electoral process. In terms of upcoming opportunities internationally, as we mentioned, the Bahrain UPR is coming up next week. My Human Rights Watch, as well as BIRD, we've all submitted during this review process, and we're hoping that our concerns can be raised. But I think, as my co-panelists have mentioned, the most important action that can be taken by the international community is for Western governments, and specifically allies of Bahrain, to publicly raise the concerns that we've identified here, both bilaterally with the Bahraini government and of course publicly. And as Mary mentioned, this needs to be followed up with actions. We need to see arms sales restricted, security cooperation restricted, until Bahrain complies with the recommendations that we've all brought forward here today.
We have just a few minutes left, so maybe Saeed or Mariam, whichever or both of you wants to take this. You both helpfully detailed the electoral conditions and how they impact ordinary citizens. So I guess my question to you, if you have any final thoughts on, more than a decade after the uprising, how do Bahraini activists regard the United States, and what kind of support are they looking for?
I think that's a great question, because I think there has been, if you had asked me a few years ago, what's my hope for Bahrain, I think I would have been a lot more hopeful. I think after 11 years of doing the work that I do, I've realized that when it comes, unfortunately, to the Middle East, when it comes to the GCC countries more specifically, a lot of times the economic exchanges, the economic and security relationships take priority over human lives and human rights. And I think that that's incredibly problematic and incredibly short-sighted. I think if, governments like the United States were to take the time to actually look at what is better for the United States long-term, economically and security-wise, they would realize that betting on dictatorships, betting on oppressive monarchies like Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, the United Arab Emirates, and so on, is actually not in their best interest. It never actually ends up going too well. And so I think that that's really, what we see time and time again is governments like the United States really shooting themselves in the foot, because they are very short-sighted in their foreign policy and how they look at countries like Bahrain and their reactions to the Bahrain situation. As civil society in Bahrain, the majority of us, I always love to say that, if you want to know the human rights situation of any country, ask where their human rights defenders are. And in Bahrain, they're either in exile, in prison, or under travel ban and silenced because of threats. And so we're still in a situation where we've been in a worsening state for 11 years now. We don't really see the Bahrainis giving any indications that things will get better. The Crown Prince of Bahrain, who's currently also the Prime Minister, has been promoting himself as the reformist in the family. And yet, unfortunately, since he's been in power as Prime Minister for 2 years now, we haven't seen any indication that the situation in Bahrain will get better. The only times we see a little bit of opening or a little bit of bettering of the situation is when we have things like, the elections coming up, or the Universal Periodic Review, or the Pope visiting entering Bahrain, and then we see the conditions for prisoners in the country getting a little bit better. And then as soon as those things are over, as soon as the cameras are gone, the situation gets worse again. And so when we have a repeat of the same situation, you can't keep doing the same thing and expecting different results. If the United States actually respects human rights and democracy, which I think if we look at the United States records, unfortunately, that's not the conclusion that I would allude to. But if the United States really wants to shift course and start respecting or holding human rights and democracy as the cornerstone and the central issue of their foreign policy, then it really needs, what we ask isn't how well they implement this or apply this to governments they don't like. It's how well do they apply these standards and principles and values to their allies.
If I may add to what Mariam stated, and this is really extremely remarkable question, how do we view the US government as ordinary Bahrainis? I would say it's a language of hypocrisy, because when they talk about struggles anywhere, when it comes into our struggle, we see a complete different directions. And these things would be simplified when it comes into the slogans of democracy and human rights. When it comes from a US administration, it has completely lost its credibility, especially at a time when there is opportunity. I'm talking about, for instances, when Biden was in Saudi Arabia to greet the King of Bahrain. You would see this is two head of states are together. You would hope, when you look into the public statement, there will be a mention somewhere of a human rights struggle in the country, the repression, or like whatever context which would indicate that there is a commitment by this administration to look into our struggle, and you see absence of it. So your public stance really matters. The second point which I wanted to say, which is extremely important, is for those children of torture survivors, of those which left the prison, or those which really suffers at the hand of the Bahraini regime. 11 years ago, I remember when the Interior Minister Sheikh Rashid was the responsible person for murdering prisoners under torture. This is not our finding. This is a government's independent commission's finding, to say that these people were killed under torture. And then later to see the very same person, Sheikh Rashid, to nominate his son to be the ambassador in the United States, and to see him traveling to the UK, there is a clear struggle here. There is, in any struggle, you see two sides. There is one side, which is the victim, and there is the abusers. And to us, the United States' current position is clearly empowering the abuser over the victims.
Well, unfortunately, this is all the time we have. I'd like to thank our panelists, Brian, Joey, Mariam, and Saeed, for this informative briefing. And I'd like to thank the Tom Lantos Human Rights Commission for organizing it. Have a great rest of your day, everyone.